Thanks for joining us once again as we take a look at Chapter 27, Part 3, World War II. This time we'll be taking a look at the War in the Pacific. And as we're well aware, December 7th, 1941 is a date which will live in infamy, as FDR spoke as war was being declared in the United States. And as the Japanese were trying to have a sneak attack upon our naval fleet to try to knock them out of commission, to try to give them free reign of the South Pacific, something that they knew they'd only have for a short time before we kind of rebuilt our naval forces and were able to launch a counterattack. Now, the U.S. did have access to a radar, which did pick up a big, kind of blip coming in early in the morning that Sunday morning, but it was kind of thought nothing big of it, as there was other airplanes of the U.S. that were supposed to be coming in later that day. Now, there were some other signs and signals that tensions, were kind of mounting and our relationship with the Japanese was deteriorating. But really, it was just kind of through really human mistakes and miscalculations and kind of the slow chain of command that kind of made us vulnerable to this attack. But luckily for the U.S., that even though much of their fleet was in harbor that day, their aircraft carriers were out on kind of maneuvers, because it's these aircraft carriers which will be vital to helping win this war in the Pacific. Plus, will kind of raise up most of the ships and fix them that were sunk or damaged in this attack and use them later on to try to defeat the Japanese. However, one ship that still rests on the bottom of the harbor is the USS Arizona. Once it was sunk by the Japanese that day, a little over 1,100 men lost their lives, and this memorial is there to commemorate that battle. And as you can kind of see the outline of the ship and the memorial that crosses over the top of it and what it kind of looks like on the inside, it actually has the names of all the sailors and Marines that lost their lives aboard that ship that day. But the U.S. was quick to strike back in what became known as the Doolittle raids that were launched in April of 1942. It was really the first air raid strikes against Japan, and it was really kind of more of a moral victory than a military one, as very little damage resulted because of these attacks. But at least America could feel kind of proud and excited that they kind of had taken a shot from the Japanese and had struck back so quickly. But as you can see, the Japanese weren't just happy with attacking, Hawaii. They were spreading their influence throughout the South Pacific, and you can kind of see the extent of which they had grown in Asia as well. However, as we had other, kind of naval personnel and troops around that region, they came under attack as well. And one of the most notorious places where kind of attack had taken place was in the Philippines. And after having surrendered to the Japanese forces, after having withstood and repelled their attack for some time, and as the soldiers were coming short on food and ammunition, they eventually surrendered. Over 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers, 12,000 of those being Americans, were being marched 60 to 100 miles in heat and humidity, and dying of thirst and starvation along the way in what became known as the Bataan Death March. But as the U.S. kind of repaired their fleet and kind of counterattacked against the Japanese onslaught, the U.S. strategy as it played out in the Pacific theater became known as island hopping. It would be too tough to defeat every island, because there's so many of them, and so the U.S. kind of picked out the most strategic ones and kind of attacked those, and then would kind of leap over the smaller ones that were not as significant or as important militarily, and kind of just pick and choose which ones they wanted to attack. But if we think about the course of war here in the Pacific, after the battle at Midway Island, really this battle kind of marks the turning point, because after this victory, there really is no more threat of a Japanese invasion of the U.S. mainland which had existed after Pearl Harbor. In fact, we were almost certain that the Japanese were going to continue eastward to California, and we were trying to prepare ourselves for that type of an attack. But little did we know that they weren't planning on that, and after the Battle of Midway, there was no more, direct threat of that ever happening. However, if we fast forward a little bit, as we kind of continued our island hopping throughout the Pacific, eventually in October of 1944, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, who had fled the Philippines before they fell, he now returned and conquered and took back, once again, those Philippine islands. And as the Americans continued their push towards Japan, they found that the Japanese, were really hunkered down on these islands, and it was very difficult to try to get them out. In fact, most Japanese either, died in battle or would kill themselves rather than give themselves up as prisoners. And so with all these different tunnels and holes and, defenses that they had set up, it proved very difficult to win these land battles against the Japanese. But here we have the famous flag raising atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, where fighting had taken place from February to March 1945. And kind of once that flag was raised, kind of show that we finally ousted the Japanese. And then we continued along to Okinawa, which was just as tough, and fought from April to June of 1945. But the closer we got to Japan and the more, we were tightening our grip, kind of around them, the more, kind of desperate they were, and they resorted to desperate means of defending themselves, like using kamikazes, where pilots, instead of dropping bombs to destroy our ships, would actually just attempt to fly their plane loaded with bombs and gas directly into the ships, attempting to sink themselves. There was also soldiers that would try to run at our lines and, blow themselves up or, inflict as much damage as they could. And we were fearful, that there was such a resistance on these outlying islands. How tough would it be to actually defeat the mainland of Japan, where we also thought that they were training their women and children to defend themselves as well? And because of that, what was started in 1939, the Manhattan Project, and cost over $2 billion to create, we had developed 3 atomic bombs. And in July of 1945, we successfully tested one of them in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the desert there. And once it proved successful, it came down to President Harry Truman, who had replaced FDR, who had died during the war here of natural causes. It came down to Truman as to whether or not we should actually use the last 2 bombs that we had. And being that his goal was to end the war as soon as possible and to save as many American lives as possible, he gave the okay. And so it came down to Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the B-29, which was called the Enola Gay, that delivered the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, which basically leveled roughly 4 square miles of that city, killing over 70,000 instantaneously and destroying over 48,000 buildings and leaving hundreds of thousands others to die of radiation poisoning and other cancers and things like that. However, the military of Japan still wouldn't allow the government to surrender, and so 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. Again, over 40,000 people were immediately killed by this blast, and hundreds of thousands more, left with radiation poisoning as well. But finally, it was after the second blast, and even though we were out of atomic bombs, it was enough to get the military and the government to agree to end the war, which officially happens on September 2nd, 1945, in what becomes known as VJ Day, or Victory over Japan. And this agreement was signed aboard the USS Missouri with General Douglas MacArthur, accepting the signatures of the Japanese, thus ending World War II. However, even though the fighting is done, we'll still have to take a look at the civilian and kind of human costs of the war in our fourth and final installment on World War II.